David Williams had been dreaming of this moment for 7 long years. As he stood in front of his new house at 412 Maple Street, keys still warm in his palm, he couldn't help but smile. The morning sun painted everything golden. The perfectly trimmed hedges, the spotless sidewalks, and the American flag gently waving from the house next door. This wasn't just any neighborhood. Willowbrook Heights was the kind of place where kids could ride their bikes safely, where neighbors actually knew each other's names, and where his 8-year-old daughter Sophie could finally have the childhood he'd always wanted to give her. After years of cramped apartments and noisy streets, this felt like stepping into a different world. David worked as a high school science teacher at Roosevelt High, and every penny of his salary had been carefully saved for this exact moment. No more splitting rent with roommates, no more explaining to Sophie why they had to move again. This house, and with its blue shutters and small front garden, was theirs. The moving truck had barely pulled away when David noticed something special about this place. Mrs. Rodriguez from across the street brought over fresh lemonade and homemade cookies. Mr. Peterson from next door offered to help carry boxes even, though David politely declined. Even the mail carrier, a cheerful woman named Betty, stopped to welcome them to the neighborhood. But it was the HOA welcome packet that really showed David what kind of place this was. 37 pages of rules and guidelines, from approved paint colors to grass height requirements. Some people might find it overwhelming, but David saw it differently. These rules meant everyone cared about keeping the neighborhood nice. These rules meant stability. Sophie loved everything about their new home. Her bedroom window looked out onto a big oak tree where squirrels played every morning. The kitchen was bright and sunny, perfect for their breakfast routine. And best of all, her new school was just 3 blocks away, close enough to walk when the weather was nice. David's daily routine became as predictable as clockwork. Every morning at 6, his alarm would go off. By 6:15, he'd have coffee brewing and Sophie's lunch packed. She'd come downstairs by 6:30, usually still rubbing sleep from her eyes, but always excited about the day ahead. Their breakfast conversations became the highlight of David's day. Sophie would tell him about her dreams, ask questions about science, or share stories about her new friends. By 7:15, they'd be walking to the bus stop together, David carrying her backpack while she skipped alongside him. The other parents at the bus stop were friendly enough. There was Jennifer, a nurse who worked night shifts and always looked tired but never complained. Tom ran his own plumbing business and was always offering to help neighbors with home repairs. And then there was Patricia. Patricia Hartwell lived in the big white house 3 doors down from David's place. She'd been in Willowbrook Heights for 12 years and knew everything about everybody. She served on the HOA board and took great pride in keeping the neighborhood looking perfect. Her lawn was always the greenest, her flowers always the brightest, and her car always the cleanest. At first, Patricia seemed pleasant enough. She complimented David on how quickly he'd settled in and praised Sophie for being such a well-behaved child at the bus stop. She even offered to share her gardening tips when David mentioned wanting to plant some flowers. David threw himself into being the best neighbor possible. He studied the HOA handbook like it was a textbook, memorizing every rule and regulation. His grass was cut every Saturday morning at exactly 8 o'clock, not too early to disturb anyone, but early enough to beat the afternoon heat. He painted his mailbox the approved shade of forest green and planted only flowers from the neighborhood's approved list. When the HOA sent out a request for volunteers to help with the annual community cleanup day, David was the first to sign up. He spent an entire Saturday picking up litter, trimming overgrown bushes, and helping elderly residents with their yard work. Other neighbors began to notice his dedication. Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned to several people how helpful David had been when her husband was in the hospital. Mr. Peterson told everyone at the grocery store about how David had shoveled his driveway after the big snowstorm without being asked. Even Betty, the mail carrier, started leaving little notes in David's mailbox, thanking him for always keeping his walkway clear and his address numbers visible. Sophie was thriving too. Her grades at the new school were excellent, and she'd made friends with several kids in the neighborhood. She joined the school's science club, which made David incredibly proud. Every evening, they'd sit at their kitchen table while Sophie did homework, and David graded papers from his own students. Their evening routine was just as structured as their mornings. Dinner was usually ready by 6, giving them time to eat together and talk about their days. Sophie would share stories about her teachers and friends, while David would tell her funny stories about his high school students, always careful not to use real names or embarrass anyone. By 8 o'clock, Sophie would be in her pajamas, teeth brushed and ready for bed. David would read her a chapter from whatever book they were working through together. Currently, it was a series about a young detective who solved mysteries in her neighborhood. Sophie loved trying to guess the solutions before the main character figured them out. Lights out was always at 8:30 sharp. David believed strongly in the importance of routine and enough sleep for growing minds. After Sophie was asleep, David would spend an hour or two preparing lessons for the next day, then usually fall asleep himself by 10:30. This peaceful routine continued for 3 wonderful months. David felt like he'd finally found their forever home. Sophie was happy and healthy. His job was going well, and the neighborhood felt like the safe haven he'd always dreamed of providing for his daughter. The other residents seemed to appreciate having David and Sophie as neighbors. He was quiet, respectful, and always willing to help when needed. His house was always neat and tidy. His yard was well maintained, and Sophie was polite and friendly to everyone she met. David often found himself standing at his kitchen window in the evenings, watching Sophie play in their small backyard, and feeling grateful for how perfectly everything had worked out. After years of struggle and uncertainty, life finally felt stable and secure. He had no idea that this perfect peace was about to be shattered by something he never could have imagined. It was a Tuesday morning in October when David's perfect world started to crack. He was getting ready for work, humming quietly while he made Sophie's lunch, when he noticed something white sticking out of his mailbox. At first, he thought it might be a flyer or maybe a welcome card from another neighbor. But when he pulled out the official-looking envelope with the HOA letterhead, his stomach dropped. The paper felt heavy and important in his hands. David had never received anything official from the HOA before, except for his welcome packet months ago. His hands actually shook a little as he opened it. The letter was typed in formal language that made it sound like a court document. The top, in bold letters, it said, "Noise violation notice. First warning." David read it once, then twice, then a third time, thinking maybe he was misunderstanding something. According to the complaint, someone had reported excessive and disturbing noise coming from his property. The letter listed specific times: 11:30 p.m. on a Thursday, 1:15 a.m. on a Saturday, and 10:45 p.m. on a Monday. The complaint mentioned loud music, shouting voices, and what sounded like furniture being moved around. David stared at the paper in complete confusion. On those exact nights, he remembered being fast asleep. Thursday had been a school night. He and Sophie were always in bed early on school nights. Saturday night, they'd watched a movie together until 8:30. Then Sophie went to bed and David had fallen asleep on the couch reading a book. Monday was just another regular night with their usual routine. The letter explained that this was his first official warning. If there were more complaints, he could face fines starting at $50 and going up to $500 for repeated violations. The HOA took noise complaints very seriously, especially during quiet hours between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. David felt sick to his stomach. He'd worked so hard to be the perfect neighbor. He'd followed every rule, been friendly to everyone, and kept his property immaculate. How could someone think he was making too much noise? It didn't make any sense. That evening, David decided to talk to his neighbors. Maybe someone had made an honest mistake about which house the noise was coming from. These things happened. Sometimes, sound could carry in funny ways, especially at night. His first stop was Mrs. Rodriguez across the street. She was watering her flowers when he walked over, and she greeted him with her usual warm smile. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I hate to bother you, but I got this letter today," David began, showing her the HOA notice. "Did you happen to hear any noise from my house lately? I'm really confused because Sophie and I are usually asleep by 9. Mrs. Rodriguez looked genuinely surprised. She put down her watering can and took a closer look at the letter. David, honey, I haven't heard anything from your house. You two are the quietest neighbors I've ever had. My bedroom window faces your house, and I would definitely notice if there was loud music or shouting. Her confused expression made David feel a little better, but also more puzzled. If Mrs. Rodriguez hadn't heard anything and she lived right across the street, then what was going on? Next, he walked over to Mr. Peterson's house. The older man was sitting on his front porch reading the evening newspaper. When David explained the situation, Mr. Peterson scratched his head thoughtfully. That's strange, Mr. Peterson said. I'm usually up pretty late watching TV, and I've never heard any noise from your place. Are you sure they got the right address? Maybe someone meant to complain about a different house. David was starting to feel relieved. Maybe it really was just a mistake. But then Mr. Peterson mentioned something that made David's blood run cold. You know, Patricia Hartwell stopped by yesterday asking if I'd heard any disturbances from your direction. I told her no, but she seemed pretty insistent that there had been problems. She's the one who filed the complaint, isn't she? David's heart sank. Patricia lived just 3 houses down, but her house wasn't even that close to his. Why would she be able to hear noise that Mrs. Rodriguez, who lived directly across the street, couldn't hear? That night, David couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the letter, about Patricia's questions to other neighbors, and about those specific times mentioned in the complaint. He got up and checked his calendar, trying to remember exactly what he'd been doing on those nights. Thursday, he'd graded papers until about 9:30, then watched the news and gone to bed by 10. Saturday, movie night with Sophie, then he'd fallen asleep reading. Monday, their usual routine, lights out by 8:30 for Sophie and by 10 for him. There was absolutely no way he'd been making noise at the times mentioned in the complaint, but who was going to believe him over Patricia, who'd lived in the neighborhood for 12 years and served on the HOA board? 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. This time, the violations were even more specific. The complaint mentioned loud bass music that rattled windows at 12:30 a.m. on a Tuesday. It described shouting and arguing at 2:15 a.m. on a Friday. It even claimed there had been sounds of heavy objects being dragged across the floor at 11:45 p.m. on a Sunday. David felt like he was losing his mind. Not only were these times when he and Sophie were definitely asleep, but they didn't even own a stereo system that could produce loud bass music. Their TV was an old model that barely got loud enough to hear from the kitchen. The second letter was more threatening than the first. It mentioned that repeated violations could lead to legal action and even forced removal from the neighborhood. David's hands were shaking as he read it. This was supposed to be their forever home. How could everything be falling apart so quickly? He decided he had to talk to Patricia directly. Maybe there was some misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a simple conversation. Maybe she was hearing noise from a different house and honestly thought it was coming from his place. That Saturday morning, David walked down to Patricia's house. Her yard was absolutely perfect, not a single weed in sight, flowers arranged in precise rows, and a lawn that looked like it belonged on a magazine cover. He rang the doorbell and waited nervously. When Patricia opened the door, her expression immediately changed from neutral to cold. She didn't even say hello, just stood there waiting for him to speak. Hi, Patricia. I'm David from down the street. I wanted to talk to you about the noise complaints. I think there might be some kind of mistake. Patricia crossed her arms and gave him a look that made him feel like a child being scolded by the principal. There's no mistake. I know what I heard. The noise from your house has been keeping me awake for weeks. David tried to explain his routine, how early he and Sophie went to bed, how they didn't even have loud music equipment. But Patricia just shook her head, her expression getting more annoyed by the minute. I don't care about your excuses, she said firmly. I've been living in this neighborhood for 12 years and I know the rules. If you can't respect your neighbor's right to peaceful sleep, maybe this isn't the right place for you. After Patricia slammed the door in his face, David walked home feeling more confused and frustrated than ever. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the 2 HOA violation letters, trying to make sense of what was happening. Sophie was at a friend's house for a play date, so he had some quiet time to think. That's when David decided he needed to protect himself and Sophie. If Patricia was going to keep making these complaints, he needed proof that they weren't doing anything wrong. He'd always been the type of person who believed in facts and evidence. It came with being a science teacher. The next day, David drove to the electronics store and bought a small security camera system. Nothing fancy or expensive, just something that could record what was actually happening at his house. The young clerk who helped him was really patient, explaining how the cameras worked and how to set up the recording system. "You'll want one that records sound too," the clerk suggested. "If someone's claiming noise violations, audio recording will be your best defense." David spent his entire Saturday afternoon installing the cameras. One pointed toward his front door, another toward the backyard where Sophie played, and a third, one inside near their living room. He made sure to read all the privacy laws first. He didn't want to accidentally record his neighbor's property or break any rules himself. The cameras had a feature that would send alerts to his phone whenever they detected sound above a certain level. David set it to a pretty sensitive setting, so even normal conversation would trigger a recording. If there really was noise coming from his house, he'd have proof of what it was and when it happened. For the first week, the cameras recorded their normal routine: Sophie coming home from school, chattering about her day, their evening dinner conversations, the sound of the TV during their weekend movie nights, David grading papers while Sophie did homework. Everything was exactly as quiet and normal as he remembered. But then something interesting started happening. David began getting phone notifications from his security system during the middle of the night. At first, he thought maybe the cameras were malfunctioning, but when he checked the recordings, he could hear noise, just not from his house. The sound was coming from somewhere else in the neighborhood. Loud music, voices, doors slamming, all the things Patricia had accused him of doing, but his cameras clearly showed his house dark and silent, while these sounds were happening in the background. David started keeping a detailed log of every noise alert. He wrote down the exact time, what the sound was, and what his cameras showed his family doing at that moment. Almost every single noise alert happened when he and Sophie were fast asleep, with their house completely quiet. After 2 weeks of recording, David had something that really shocked him. The times when his cameras picked up neighborhood noise matched almost exactly with the times listed in Patricia's complaints against him, but the recordings clearly showed the noise wasn't coming from his property. David decided he needed to talk to more neighbors. Maybe other people had noticed these nighttime disturbances too. Maybe someone else could help him figure out where the real noise was coming from. His first stop was Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who lived 2 houses down from Patricia. Mrs. Chen was known for being a light sleeper and often complained about delivery trucks coming too early in the morning. "Oh, David," Mrs. Chen said when he explained the situation. "I'm so glad you came to talk to me. Patricia asked me to back up her complaints about your house, but I had to tell her I couldn't do that." David's heart started beating faster. "What do you mean?" "Well, she wanted me to sign a statement saying I'd heard loud music and shouting from your house. But honestly, I've never heard anything like that from your direction. Your house is one of the quietest on the street." Mrs. Chen went on to explain that she'd actually been hearing noise lately, but it seemed to be coming from the opposite direction. "Sometimes I hear music and voices late at night, but it sounds like it's coming from down near Patricia's end of the street." David's next stop was the Johnson family, who lived right next door to Patricia. Mr. Johnson worked night shifts at the hospital, so he was often awake during the late hours when the complaints were happening. "Yeah, we've definitely heard some noise lately," Mr. Johnson confirmed. "My wife mentioned it because it sometimes wakes her up. But David, I hate to tell you this, it's not coming from your house. We can see your house from our bedroom window, and it's always dark and quiet when we hear the disturbances." David felt a mixture of relief and growing suspicion. "Do you have any idea where the noise is actually coming from?" Mr. Johnson looked uncomfortable. "Look, I don't want to start neighborhood drama, but the noise seems to be coming from Patricia's house. She has people over sometimes, and they can get pretty loud. Last weekend, there was music playing until almost 2 in the morning." This was the breakthrough David had been hoping for, but it also made him feel sick. If Patricia was making noise herself and then blaming him for it, this was much worse than a simple misunderstanding. David spent the next few days quietly talking to other neighbors. The story was the same everywhere. Nobody had heard noise coming from David's house. Several people mentioned hearing late-night disturbances, but they all seemed to point toward the same area of the neighborhood. Mrs. Rodriguez told him that Patricia had come to her 3 times asking her to support the noise complaints. I told her every time that I hadn't heard anything from your house. She got pretty upset with me about it. Even Betty, the mail carrier, had something interesting to share. Patricia stopped me last week and asked if I'd noticed anything unusual about your house during my morning route. I told her you folks are always quiet and respectful. She didn't seem happy with that answer. David was starting to see a pattern. Patricia wasn't just filing complaints, she was actively trying to get other neighbors to back up her story. When they refused to lie for her, she filed the complaints anyway. The most disturbing conversation was with Tom, the plumber who lived near the bus stop. Tom had been doing some late-night emergency calls lately and had been driving through the neighborhood at odd hours. I've seen Patricia's house with lights on and cars in the driveway pretty late at night, Tom told David quietly. Last Thursday, I drove by around midnight, and there was definitely a party or gathering going on there. Music, people talking, in the backyard. But that was the same night she filed a complaint about noise from your house. David felt like pieces of a puzzle were finally coming together. But the picture they formed was uglier than he'd expected. Patricia wasn't just mistaken about where noise was coming from. She seemed to be deliberately lying about it. That night, David sat down with all his evidence. Security camera footage showing his house quiet during complaint times. Audio recordings of actual neighborhood noise that didn't come from his property. Statements from multiple neighbors saying they'd never heard disturbances from his house. And most damning of all, several witnesses who'd seen or heard activity at Patricia's house during the exact times she'd complained about him. But David also realized something else. This wasn't just about noise complaints anymore. Patricia had tried to turn other neighbors against him. She'd asked multiple people to lie to support her false accusations. When they refused, she'd filed complaints anyway, knowing they were false. The question now was what to do with this information. David had always believed in handling problems quietly and respectfully. But Patricia's behavior was threatening his home and his daughter's stability. He couldn't let false accusations destroy the life he'd worked so hard to build for Sophie. David had been recording everything for 3 weeks when something happened that changed everything. It was a Wednesday night, and he'd just finished helping Sophie with her math homework. They'd had dinner, watched a nature documentary together, and Sophie was fast asleep by 8:30 as usual. David was grading his students' science tests at the kitchen table when his phone buzzed with a security alert at 11:47 p.m. He almost ignored it, thinking it was probably just a car driving by or maybe a neighbor's dog barking. But something made him check the notification. The camera had detected loud noise, but when David looked at the footage from his house, everything was completely quiet. His living room was dark, Sophie's bedroom was silent, and there wasn't a single sound coming from inside his home. Yet, the audio was clearly picking up music and voices. David put on his headphones and listened more carefully to the recording. The sound quality was good enough that he could make out actual conversations and even recognize some of the songs playing. But here's what made his blood run cold. The sound was coming from outside his house, not inside. He spent the next hour going through his security footage from different angles, trying to figure out where the noise was actually coming from. Then he discovered something that made his hands shake. When he enhanced the audio and really focused on the direction of the sound, it was clearly coming from down the street in the direction of Patricia's house. David couldn't sleep that night. The next morning, he decided to do something he'd been thinking about for weeks. He walked around the neighborhood early before anyone else was awake and noticed something interesting. Patricia's house had a large backyard that wasn't visible from the street. There were tall privacy fences and mature trees that blocked the view from most directions. But from one specific angle near the community mailboxes, David could see into part of Patricia's backyard. He didn't want to spy on anyone, but he was curious about what he might discover. That weekend, David asked Sophie if she wanted to help him organize their mail and check the community bulletin board near the mailboxes. It was a perfectly innocent reason to be in that area, and Sophie loved helping with grown-up tasks. While Sophie read the community announcements about upcoming events, David casually glanced toward Patricia's backyard. What he saw made his stomach drop. There were chairs set up on her patio, empty bottles on a table, and what looked like speakers near her back door. "Daddy, look at this," Sophie said, pointing to a notice on the bulletin board. "There's going to be a movie night in the park next Friday. Can we go?" David tried to focus on his daughter, but his mind was racing. If Patricia had been hosting gatherings in her backyard, that would explain the late-night noise. But why would she blame him for noise she was making herself? That evening, David decided to check his security recordings more systematically. He went back through every single noise alert from the past month, listening carefully and noting the exact times. Then he cross-referenced those times with the HOA complaint letters Patricia had filed against him. The pattern was absolutely shocking. Every single time Patricia had filed a noise complaint about David's house, his security cameras had recorded actual noise happening in the neighborhood at almost the exact same time. But the noise wasn't coming from his house. It was coming from the direction of Patricia's property. David felt sick as he realized what this meant. Patricia wasn't making honest mistakes about where noise was coming from. She was making noise herself and then immediately filing complaints blaming David for it. But the discovery that really broke David's heart came when he started looking at the dates more carefully. Patricia's complaints weren't random. They seemed to happen right after positive things occurred in David's life. The first complaint came 2 days after David had been recognized at a school board meeting for his excellent teaching. The second complaint was filed the day after Sophie won first place in the school science fair. The third complaint happened right after David had been featured in the neighborhood newsletter for organizing a successful charity drive. David realized that Patricia wasn't just making false noise complaints. She was actively trying to tear down his reputation in the community every time something good happened to him or Sophie. The final piece of evidence came completely by accident. David was reviewing footage from the previous weekend when he noticed something strange. At 12:15 a.m. on Saturday night, his camera had picked up the sound of music and laughter. His house showed completely dark and quiet as usual. But this time, David could see something else in the footage. Car headlights were visible in the background, and he could make out people walking along the sidewalk. The audio picked up fragments of conversation as people were leaving what sounded like a party. David enhanced the audio as much as he could and listened carefully. He could hear people saying goodbye, car doors closing, and engines starting. Then he heard something that made his blood freeze. A woman's voice, clearly recognizable as Patricia's, was saying goodbye to her guests. "Thanks for coming," she was saying. "Don't worry about the noise. I'll just blame it on that new guy. Down the street like I always do." David had to replay that part of the recording 3 times to make sure he'd heard it correctly. Patricia was openly admitting to her guests that she was framing him for noise violations. But there was more. As Patricia's guests were leaving, David could hear her talking to someone else. "I've got another complaint ready to file on Monday," she was saying. "Eventually the HOA will force him out, and then maybe we can get someone more suitable for this neighborhood." David sat in his dark kitchen staring at his phone screen, trying to process what he'd just discovered. This wasn't about noise at all. Patricia was conducting a deliberate campaign to force him and Sophie out of their home. The next morning, David went through all his evidence one more time. Security footage showing his house quiet during every alleged violation. Audio, recordings of actual noise coming from Patricia's direction. Witness statements from neighbors who'd never heard disturbances from his house. And now, a recording of Patricia actually admitting to framing him. David also started noticing other patterns he'd missed before. Patricia's complaints always included very specific details about the type of music, the volume level, and the duration of the disturbances. But when David listened to his security recordings, those details perfectly matched the actual noise that had been coming from her own property. She wasn't just making up random complaints, she was describing her own parties and gatherings, then claiming they'd happened at David's house instead. The most disturbing realization was how calculated and methodical Patricia's harassment had been. She'd tried to recruit other neighbors to support her false claims. When they refused, she'd filed complaints anyway. She'd timed her accusations to coincide with David's achievements and positive recognition in the community. David understood now that Patricia wasn't just a difficult neighbor making noise complaints. She was someone who had decided that David and Sophie didn't belong in Willowbrook Heights, and she was willing to lie, manipulate, and harass them until they left. The HOA hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. David had been dreading it for weeks, worried about how to defend himself against accusations he couldn't understand. But now, with a folder full of evidence and recordings that proved Patricia's deception, David felt something he hadn't felt in months. He felt ready to fight back. The night before the HOA hearing, David couldn't eat dinner. His stomach was twisted in knots, and even Sophie noticed something was wrong. "Daddy, are you okay?" she asked, looking up from her homework with concern in her 8-year-old eyes. David managed a smile and ruffled her hair. "Everything's going to be fine, sweetheart. Daddy just has an important meeting tomorrow." But David wasn't sure if everything would be fine. Even with all his evidence, he was still nervous about facing the HOA board. Patricia had been a member for 12 years. She knew these people personally. Would they really believe a newcomer over someone they'd trusted for so long? David spent hours that night organizing his evidence into a clear presentation. He had time-stamped videos, audio recordings, written statements from neighbors, and most importantly, the recording of Patricia admitting to framing him. He practiced what he would say, trying to keep his emotions in check and focus on the facts. The HOA meeting was held in the community center at 7 p.m. on Thursday. When David arrived, he was surprised to see how many neighbors had shown up. Usually these meetings only had a few people, but tonight the room was packed. Mrs. Rodriguez gave him an encouraging nod from across the room. Mr. Johnson was there with his wife. Even Mrs. Chen had come, despite usually avoiding community meetings. David realized that word had spread about what was happening, and people wanted to see how it would turn out. Patricia was already seated at the board table, looking confident and composed. She was wearing a professional navy blue suit and had a thick folder of papers in front of her. When she saw David, she gave him a cold smile that made his skin crawl. The HOA president, a friendly man named Robert Martinez, called the meeting to order. "We're here tonight to address the ongoing noise complaints filed by board member Patricia Hartwell against resident David Williams. Patricia, would you like to present your case first?" Patricia stood up and began her presentation with complete confidence. She talked about her 12 years of service to the community, her commitment to maintaining neighborhood standards, and her responsibility to protect residents from disturbances. "I've tried to work with Mr. Williams privately," she said, her voice full of fake sympathy. "But the noise violations have continued. We have multiple documented complaints spanning several months. This isn't about targeting anyone. It's about maintaining the peaceful environment that makes Willowbrook Heights special." Patricia presented her complaint letters, describing in detail the loud music, shouting, and disturbances she claimed to have heard. She painted a picture of David as an inconsiderate neighbor who refused to follow community rules. "I've spoken with several neighbors about this issue," Patricia continued. "While some may be reluctant to speak publicly, the noise problem is real and ongoing." When Patricia finished, the room was quiet. Her presentation had been smooth and professional. If David hadn't known the truth, he might have believed her himself. Robert turned to David. "Mr. Williams, you have the floor to respond to these allegations." David stood up, his hands trembling slightly as he held his folder of evidence. He looked around the room at his neighbors' faces, took a deep breath, and began. "Thank you, Mr. Martinez. I want to start by saying that I have great respect for this community and for the HOA's role in maintaining our neighborhood standards. When I first received these complaints, I was genuinely confused because I knew they couldn't be accurate." David explained how he'd installed security cameras to document what was really happening at his house. He showed the board time-stamped footage of his home being completely quiet during every single time Patricia had claimed there were noise violations. "But here's where it gets interesting," David continued, feeling his confidence grow. My cameras didn't just record silence from my house, they also picked up the actual noise that was happening in our neighborhood during those same times. David played audio recordings that clearly showed noise coming from elsewhere in the neighborhood, not from his property. The room was completely silent as everyone listened to the evidence. I started talking to neighbors to understand what was happening, David said, and I discovered something troubling. Patricia had approached several residents asking them to support her complaints against me. When they refused because they'd never heard any noise from my house, she filed the complaints anyway. One by one, neighbors stood up to confirm David's story. Mrs. Rodriguez spoke about Patricia's repeated attempts to get her to lie. Mr. Johnson described how the noise was actually coming from Patricia's direction. Mrs. Chen explained how she'd been asked to sign false statements. The mood in the room began to shift. People were looking at Patricia with confusion and growing anger. She was starting to look less confident, her professional composure beginning to crack. But the most shocking discovery, David said, came when my security system recorded something I never expected to hear. David played the audio recording of Patricia talking to her guests, clearly admitting that she blamed the noise from her own parties on David. The room erupted in gasps and angry murmurs as people heard Patricia's own voice confessing to framing him. Patricia stood up abruptly, her face red with anger and embarrassment. That recording was taken illegally. He was spying on my private conversations. David remained calm. The recording was made by security cameras on my own property, which is completely legal. And it captured audio from a conversation happening in your backyard during one of your gatherings. Robert Martinez looked stunned. The other board members were whispering among themselves, clearly disturbed by what they'd heard. The room was buzzing with shocked conversations. Patricia, Robert said firmly, these are very serious allegations. Do you have any explanation for what we just heard? Patricia tried to defend herself, but her explanations became increasingly desperate and contradictory. She claimed David had somehow edited the recordings, that the neighbors were lying, that there was a conspiracy against her. But the evidence was overwhelming. Multiple witnesses, clear video footage, audio recordings, and Patricia's own voice admitting to her deception. The board called for a brief recess to discuss the situation privately. When they returned, Robert's expression was grave. After reviewing all the evidence presented tonight, the board has reached several decisions. First, all complaints against Mr. Williams are hereby dismissed and removed from his record. Second, Patricia Hartwell is immediately removed from her position on the HOA board. Third, Patricia will be fined for each false complaint filed, totaling $2,000. The room burst into applause. David felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he also felt something else, sadness for how unnecessary all of this had been. As people began to leave, many neighbors came up to David to apologize for not speaking up sooner and to congratulate him on standing up for himself. Mrs. Rodriguez hugged him tightly. "I'm so proud of you for not giving up," she whispered. But David surprised everyone with what he said next. He stood up and asked for everyone's attention. "I want to thank you all for your support tonight, but I also want to say something about moving forward as a community. What happened here was wrong, but responding with anger won't make our neighborhood stronger." David looked directly at Patricia, who was packing up her papers with tears in her eyes. "I don't want this to tear our community apart. Patricia made serious mistakes, but I believe people can change when they're given the opportunity to learn and grow." David proposed that instead of just punishing Patricia, the community should work together to create programs that would help prevent this kind of situation in the future. He suggested conflict resolution training, better communication channels between neighbors, and regular community events to help people get to know each other better. "I became a teacher because I believe in second chances and the power of education," David said. "If Patricia is willing to participate in community service and learn from this experience, I think that would be better for everyone than simply punishment." The room was quiet as people absorbed David's words. Even Patricia looked surprised by his offer of grace instead of revenge. Over the following months, something remarkable happened in Willowbrook Heights. Patricia did participate in community service, working with local organizations to learn about conflict resolution and community building. She never became close friends with David, but she did apologize publicly for her actions. More importantly, the neighborhood came together in ways it never had before. They started monthly community meetings, organized block parties, and created a neighborhood watch program, focused on helping rather than policing each other. David's response to injustice with patience and education became a model that other communities heard about and tried to follow. Sophie grew up in a neighborhood that had learned the importance of truth, fairness, and giving people chances to change. And David never forgot the lesson that sometimes the most powerful response to hate is the refusal to hate back.